My name is Sam Nicoletti, and I see murders before they happen. A little voice tells me the killer's name and address. And if I stop them, I save a life. If I ignore them, an innocent human dies. What would you do in my situation?
Psychic Sam is a classic boys comic. It's about a guy with a big gun who goes out and solves problems, and he hears voices in his head tell him to kill bad guys. The only trouble is the bad guys haven't done anything yet, but every time he ignores it, someone innocent dies, and it's only a matter of time before the bodies start piling up.
I'm working with a guy named Mark Millar. Mark and I started on Wolverine together, and we got to create Kick-Ass, and we had a brilliant time. It changed our lives. So now we come up with a third collaboration, and it's called Psychic Sam, and I have the legend Klaus Janson working with me, and then the brilliant Bill Crabtree doing the color art. And we are having an all-out blast with this.
The big news is we're also doing a movie of Psychic Sam. There's a guy called Ivan Atkinson who's brilliant. He's Guy Ritchie's producer, and he's produced some of my favourite films from Guy. Wrath of Man, The Gentleman, all these amazing films Guy's been doing over the last few years.
Ivan Atkinson, yeah. I'm excited to be teaming up with Mark Millar and his exciting new project, Psychic Sam. Mark and I have been talking about working together for a number of years, and I found the project that I think brings fascinating characters and action together, reminding me of the films I grew up loving.
This is completely outside of Millar World and Netflix and all the stuff I've been doing for the last 20 years, really. None of those books will be affected, and all our new titles will still be out there every month. I just carved out a wee holiday for myself and thought about doing something for maybe Marvel or DC again. Then I thought, wouldn't it be great to do some creator-owned with Johnny Romita Jr.?
There's so many great tiers to this, so many great levels to this. We're gonna do a black and white version with a painted cover.
Done in the style of a 1970s Marvel magazine, beautifully packaged in that big magazine-size format. There's hardcovers, there's t-shirts, there's trading cards, there's stickers.
Spectacular stuff. You can also get written and drawn into the issues, which would be a lot of fun. I have to do justice to all of you.
We're assembling a fantastic team of filmmakers on this production, and we will have some more information for you guys soon.
We just are having so much fun with the character. It's probably as good as it gets, but the fact that it's the third time with Mark, it's a charm.
I think there's something special brewing here, so don't miss it.
Hey there, Steve. How's it going?
Good, Mark. How are you?
Very well. Thanks for taking the time.
Sure.
I know you've got a big trip coming up. Where are you off to?
I'm sorry, say it again.
I know you've got a big trip coming up. Whereabouts are you off to?
Yeah. We have family back on the East Coast, and we're going to go back, see them, and then go on to New York for vacation.
Right, cool. That's great. Well, listen, thanks for taking the time. I mean, one of the treats for me doing this, really, is getting to talk to writers whose stuff I've always loved, and comics is a small world. You tend to run into everyone, but you and I have never actually met face to face.
No, I think the last show I did in Europe was in London, but that was pre-pandemic, I think.
I remember you actually coming when I was like a teenager, and I didn't have the money. I was up in Scotland, and you were in London, and there was kind of a buzz. I mean, this was maybe 80s, maybe even earlier, and there was a buzz around the comic stores. There was one guy had enough money to get down and get a book signed.
I went to Glasgow a couple of times, I know. Did a couple of shows in Glasgow back then. Would love to go back, but I haven't been there since, no.
Oh, amazing. That must have been one of those conventions John McShane organised. Like, he was amazing at getting Americans to come all the way to rainy Glasgow.
That's not the name I remember, but it was, probably that.
Fantastic. That's great. So, no, it's funny because you've always seemed very enigmatic to me. Like, most people's comic book careers tend to follow a kind of formula. They start in their teens, they're still doing it in their 70s and 80s, and everybody kind of follows that Marvel DC kind of beats. And I remember your resume, just always seemed fascinating to me. Your work was unlike anybody else's, but your life always felt a little bit different from the other guys too. Like, I'd hear about you touring Europe with your wife. you
Yeah.
know, like, which Americans never do, really, you know, like for any length of time, you know. You seem to be reading the kind of stuff that the regular guys weren't reading and everything, you know. And your career, you know, at one point you're at Atari, whenever Atari is like the hottest thing going and everything. So I could never quite anticipate what was coming next from you, which was always interesting.
Well, I couldn't anticipate it either. When I got started, Dick Giordano was a good friend of mine. Did you know Dick?
He was my absolute hero, and I only got to know him once he got deaf and he couldn't understand a word I was saying, you know. So like, 'cause my accent was so bad. But one of my great regrets, because he and Neil Adams and that whole scene just seemed like the coolest thing ever to me.
Right. Well, he was a friend. We both lived in Connecticut, and you know, when I first started writing, I went over to his house to visit, and he was inking while the TV was on. And he said, "This, you know, I love being an inker because the TV's on, and I just sit there and I put the lines down." And this led to a conversation where he said, "I'm glad I'm not a writer because every writer I've ever met in comics burns out." And I was just getting started, so I said, "I'm not going to do that." And so I kind of had that in the back of my mind that if, you know, I always said the great thing about writing comics was that you got to do a new story every week. Yeah. And the bad thing about comics was you had to do a new story every week. And when the bad part started to overwhelm me, I would go do something else. You know, that was the thing. I didn't want to just grind myself down to burnout. You know, so I guess comics, I love comics, and I really enjoyed doing comics, but it was never like my be all and end all. My be all and end all was to have a good life, you know? So, we ran around Europe for 9 months in a Volkswagen van. I worked for Atari. I wrote children's books. I wrote adult books. I did animation, all that stuff as adjuncts to comics. I mean, when I would get to the point where I wanted to write stories again every week, then I would come back. Although that's a little facile too. It was, I was working at Atari, as you say, designing games and having a good time. And this was 82 to 84. So it was like just at the beginning of the computer age. And I was using an Atari computer, which had 64K of memory on it, you know? And I went down to San Diego in 84, and both Giordano and Shooter came up and said, you know, would you want to do comics again? And I'm like, no, I'm good. And then I got home that Sunday night, and my boss at Atari called me up, and he said, they just sold the company, and we're all going to get fired on Wednesday. So I called up Giordano and Shooter the next morning, on Monday morning, and I said, actually, you know, I've rethought that. So that's why I came back in the 80s, and then you know, I mean, again, I would come and go. I just, you know, comics, I don't know. You started this off by saying that I didn't, you know, it was not clear exactly what I was going to do from time to time. I remember Andy Helfer, when editor at DC, said that's your biggest flaw, is that nobody knows what you're going to do every time. And I said, well, I think that's my biggest attribute, you know, so I just tried to write good comics when I was writing comics, or tried to design good games when I was designing games, or whatever. And in between, I like to travel, you know. I just, you know, just trying to have a good time. Good life.
I always thought you brought something that other people didn't, that extra dimension. And I was amazed how young you were when you were doing this stuff. You know, I always assumed you were like a middle-aged guy or something, you know, because you seem to have this incredible knowledge. You know, when I was a kid and I'm reading your stuff, books like Doctor Strange and everything, you know, you're practically, you know, just at a college age, really, you know, when you're doing that stuff. But there seems to be an intellect to your stuff, I think, that other people had too, you know. Guys were very literate, comic people tend to be, but yours just seemed that little bit more mature, you know, your Batman in particular and so on. It felt that there was a dimension that I hadn't seen before in comics. And even as a kid, I was wowed by this. But I guess that's what you brought to it, your life experience.
I think so, yeah. I mean, Batman is a specific case because I just loved that character. But I mean, I loved all my characters. I really like writing characters, you know, getting inside the heads of all these different people. And comics was great for that because there were so many characters and you know, I had an opportunity to write pretty much everybody. So yeah, I mean, I just took, you know, when I was a fan, I remember I would read particular comics and I go, this is good. I like this, you know, and I just file that away. And so when it was time for me to write stuff, I just, you know, would sort of say, what's the vibe that I think is going to work here? And, you know, what can I do with this character? And so on and so forth. I mean, so yeah, I mean, I brought my life experience to it. You were right the first time, but I mean, I'm just sort of talking now for the sake of talking. But yeah, you know, I mean, I would say, again, comics was not my only area of interest. And well, you mentioned I am just talking now, but I mean, you mentioned Doctor Strange. When I took over Doctor Strange, I said, I need to know about magic. You know, I mean, if I'm writing this guy, I could write him as just a comic book superhero who does things, you know. But if he's the Sorcerer Supreme, he's supposed to know stuff. So I felt it was incumbent upon me to learn some of that stuff. And you know, I can't say that when I wrote Batman, I went out and beat people up in alleys, but you know, I mean, I tried to do the characters as, you know, as best I could. That's all.
So, like Doctor Strange, for example, like where did you dig in? What form did that take in terms of your research?
Well, this was the 70s, and 70s there was a lot of magic books, organizations, etc. And New York City had a bookstore called Weiser's, which was famous. It had, you know, it was the occult bookstore. So I just rolled in there after I got that assignment. Well, it wasn't an assignment, but in any event, I just went down there and I said, I don't know anything, but what can I start with? What can I learn? And they sold me $100 worth of books, whatever. And I went and read them and, you know, and started to get a feel for what a magical mindset was. I was not the Sorcerer Supreme by any stretch of the imagination, but at least I understood the ambiance of the thing and some of the, you know, places you could go with it. And so I went there, you know, I mean, I did that stuff. Yeah.
I guess if you were a guy at that time, maybe not reading comics, like my brothers were like this, you know, but they maybe read, you know, like Moorcroft, or they would maybe read Robert Anton Wilson or something like this, you know. Then they had a sort of way into comics at an age where they were probably becoming a little bit too old for comic books themselves. You know, there was a lot of cool counterculture stuff starting to seep into Marvel, like that next gen on from, like Stan, I don't think would have been especially interested in the kind of things the 70s writers were doing. But there was an entire audience emerging for that kind of thing, I guess, wasn't there? And that runs through all of your work, whether it's the more political Captain America, whether it's, you know, the spooky Doctor Strange and so on, you know? So you just seem to be a guy in the right place at the right time.
Yes, I've said that many times. I was very lucky. Whatever talents I had were perfectly suited for the place I walked into. And another thing that I always point out, when Stan hired Roy and Danny O'Neill to be his assistant editors, he drilled them to make sure that they sounded exactly like him, because he had been the only voice, right? And he didn't want the voice to change. But when Roy took over, for whatever reason, Roy just said, you guys do what you want to do. I mean, there were two caveats. It has to come in on time every month, and it has to sell. And if you can do that, you can do anything. So I walked into a situation where I had complete creative freedom, which is not the normal way you start out working in any business, and not the normal way that it runs anymore either, you know. But I mean, at the time, I mean, you know, he just said, you're going to, do Captain America, right? I mean, today, somebody doing Captain America would have to go through multi-levels of editorial and Disney and all that kind of stuff, right? But in those days, just like, yeah, go write Captain America. So it was great. And I hope I took full advantage of it.
And did you feel that the age group of the audience was changing? Just from being a writer at the company, did you have a sense that the kind of guys who were reading Stan and Jack in 1965 were very different from the age group and the demographic that you were appealing to by early mid-70s? Did the audience come up with you?
I don't think so. What I had heard when I was a fan in the 60s was that college people are reading Marvel comics. Right. And I was a couple of years out of college when I went to work there. Mm-hmm. I certainly had been reading them. So, but also it was a time, the 70s. I mean, there was a lot of black liberation. There was a lot of women's liberation going on. There was the Vietnam War that people didn't want to be involved in. So it was a more intellectually fermentable time period. And as a young guy, who was interested in the world, and there was a lot of world to be interested in. So that, again, that contributed to my getting knowledge from all over the place and paying attention to things that didn't necessarily translate directly into comics, but then could be part of the gestalt that I was working with. So I always figured the audience was in their 20s and 30s. Right. There was certainly a children's audience. We still had the Comics Code. And so, you had to, you had limits on how far you could go on sex and stuff like that. But I never felt like, the audience isn't going to get this.
Right.
I always thought the audience will understand this. Another just story of my personal life. I remember when I was a kid, I was talking to some adult and he was talking down to me. And I thought, he thinks kids are dumber than they are, And so I put that in my brain. Don't ever assume that kids are dumber than you think they are. And so, I guess I wrote for people who had some sort of, I need to do something about that light on my head, some sort of intelligence, and I did turn it in on time and it did sell. So obviously, it was working. The letters came in those days. It was letters through the post office with stamps, and people were happy with what was going on. So it seemed to me that I was doing the right thing.
It's funny that the smart kid reader, is something that people almost forget about, don't they? But I remember when I was a kid, I was reading your stuff. I was very young, and I didn't know what I liked about it, but I knew I liked it. And it's the same with my favourite movies. At the time, I didn't realise Michael Curtiz or Billy Wilder or Alfred Hitchcock are making these pictures, but I just knew they were my favourite pictures, So children are more sophisticated than people give them credit for too sometimes, don't they?
Yeah.
They might not know the names.
Sorry?
They might not know the names of the creatives, but they know they like the stories.
Yeah. No, I've heard that a lot. And I had another thought, but I lost it there. But go, and I'll stop. Go ahead. Ask me something. It'll come back to me.
But I'm curious because age-wise, you probably were into DC before you get into Marvel, in the sense that Stan and Jack, it kind of blew up when you were maybe early teens or something, where you probably did. Well, reading comics as a little kid, were you reading DCs and things like that?
Yeah, when I was a kid, which was the 50s for me, it was pretty much Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Martian Manhunter in the back, whatever. I think it was pretty much all DC that I read as a kid, and eventually outgrew them the way kids do, right? But then when I was reintroduced to Marvel, then, I discovered the Marvel way of doing things. The comics in the 50s, I was a big fan of Dick Sprang, for example, the Batman artist, right? It was the art that really interested me here and there, because the stories were just formulaic. It was, it was DC in the 50s. They weren't
Yeah.
They weren't trying to do much story wise, but there were good artists. When I came back to comics in the 60s, having been reintroduced through Marvel, then I sort of read everybody. I mean, I read Charlton and Gold Key and, everything, romance, Westerns. I just loved comics. I just, found out that I really, really did like comics and anything that was a comic, including Patsy and Hetty and stuff like that. I mean, it was, it was interesting to me. That's again, I have a thing, drives my wife crazy, but if I get interested in something, I don't feel that I know it until I've seen all of it. Mm-hmm. I can't sort of get 90% of something and then just say, well, I'll just extrapolate what that other 10% is. It's like, no, because there, things might be happening in there and I don't know what they are. So, I mean, over the years, I've gotten deeply into opera. I've gotten deeply into detective stories. I mean, it's like, and so I want to hear every opera. I want to read every good detective story, and again, that's just building whatever knowledge I have to make use of. So, yeah. No, I did not read anything. I don't think I read anything other than DC's in the 50s.
And then at an age when you'd probably be getting out of it, had Marvel become cool when you were at college or something? People were starting to read this stuff? Or what got you back in?
Say that again.
What was it that brought you back into comics as a teenager when you were older? But normally at an age you would be checking out of comics?
No, well, I was in college, actually. It was the end of my freshman year in college.
Right.
And for whatever reason, because again, I wasn't reading comics, but somebody on the dorm, for whatever reason, came up to me and handed me a Ditko Spider-Man and said, "You've got to read this."
Yeah.
I don't know why he thought that I would be the guy who would, because I don't remember. I wasn't paying attention to comics at all. But anyway, I read the Ditko Spider-Man and I liked it and went down to the newsstand in the little town where I was in college, and they were very laissez-faire about their shelves. So they still had like 3 months worth of everything from Marvel there. So I not only got to find all the other characters, but I got to find the soap opera aspects and the continuity and all that sort of thing. And then that summer when I was home, out of college for the summer, I was able to find like antique stores downtown in the town I lived in that had like nickel comic boxes. And I can happily say that I got Spider-Man #1 for a nickel and, and all that stuff, I mean, it still wasn't a thing. I mean, conventions didn't really start till the late 60s.
Yeah.
Roy Thomas and some people were sitting out in Missouri turning out hand-produced fanzines, but there was no organized, widespread interest in comics, and therefore most people didn't consider them worth anything, and therefore if you did, you could go find treasures for a nickel.
Amazing.
And so I was just completely, I was heavily back into comics at that time, really liked all the stuff that Marvel was doing. But again, by that time, I started reading everybody. And so Magnus Robot Fighter, I mean, all whatever. It just, if it was good, then I wanted to read it and did that until I had a chance to get into the business. And I mean, that's a whole story. I don't know if you want that or not as to how, what happened after.
I'd be fascinated because it amazes me that, now with the internet, we can all be in touch with each other instantly. You can find whoever you're looking for. But you're talking about a period before there's even comic stores. So
right.
The idea that you all somehow found each other quite quickly is fascinating,
Yeah, well, my situation was after I got out of college, I was taken into the Army because it was Vietnam War time.
Yeah.
And I was able to, keep collecting while I was in the Army. And one day one Friday afternoon, I didn't have anything that I was supposed to do in the Army. And again, I can look back on it, and all I can say is, for whatever reason, I hopped on a train and I went to New York, and I went to D.C., and I got there about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And I knew, through whatever information channels there were, that Neil Adams liked to work at D.C. That had a light box that he liked, and he liked to stay there after hours and work. And so I went in and I said, is it possible that I could speak to Neil Adams? And they went and they checked and they said, yeah, okay, come back. And Neil was working, and, I was trying to be an artist. It was the art that interested me. And so I said, we chatted, whatever. And then I said, when I get out of the Army, do you think you might want an assistant? And he said, why not start now? And I said, because I'm in the Army. And he said, well, can you come up every weekend? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, do that then. And so I was in Maryland, which is a couple hours by train from New York. So every weekend thereafter, I would come up. I'd join him on Friday nights at D.C. We'd work till 1 a.m. We'd go get some food. I'd go sleep on a couch at Columbia University in New York in the student union room. And then I'd go out to his house on Saturday and spend all day Saturday working. And then on Sunday, I'd go back to the Army. And I did that for 6 months until I got out of the Army. And during that time, Neil and I had done a story for Vampirella. It wasn't a Vampirella story, but it was for her magazine. And he insisted on having my name on it, even though nobody ever credits their assistants, right? But he said, you'll have a published credit. When you come to New York full time, you'll have a published credit. So then I did that. And and this segues, we started a while ago talking about how I was in the right place at the right time. So I went to New York. I put in about a year, working as a young artist, doing, backups for Murray Boltinoff and romance stories and whatever. And then Gary Friedrich, the thing about, you talked about no internet. The thing about comics in those days was everybody had to physically move to New York, right? Because you had to hand things to people. You had to get things. Yeah. The cool thing about that was 99% of everybody in comics was there. That's amazing. So we had our own little bubble in the vast New York melting pot, like every other bubble in the vast New York melting pot. But there was the comic book people. And so I got to know Wally Wood, and I got to know Bill Everett, and Jerry Conway and Marv Wolfman and all the rest of these people. And so one of the people I got to know was Gary Friedrich, who was writing Sergeant Fury and Nick Fury, I think, at that point. And a stewardess, now called a flight attendant, was murdered in the apartment above where Gary lived. And his wife, who was from New York, said, I'm not comfortable living downstairs from where a murder took place. Can we go out to Missouri, where you're from, in the Midwest of America, for the summer? And so Gary called me up and he said, would you like to fill in for me for 6 weeks at Marvel on staff, the lowest level guy, but there's going to be a 6-week opening here. Would you like that? And I almost said no, because I was living 2 hours by train outside the city. So it was 2 hours in and 2 hours out every day if I was going to do that. So I said to Roy when I went in there, I said, I'll do it 4 days a week. And I don't think Roy cared, what does it matter, the low level guy? So I got that thing. And at the end of 6 weeks, Gary didn't want to come back. He liked it in Missouri, and he didn't want to do any work. And so he had this 6-page monster story that he was supposed to dialogue. It was all drawn, Sid Shores. So he sent it back. He didn't want to do it. Find somebody else. And so they looked around the office and they found me. They said, hey, would you want to write this thing? I was not a writer. I had not planned on being a writer, but I said, sure, yeah, I'll do anything, right? And I wrote it, and I liked writing it, and they liked what I wrote. So then they said, well, you want to do some more? And I said, yeah. And then so that's how, I eventually ended up doing it full time.
That's amazing. So it's funny, every writer I know pretty much started off wanting to be an artist. Like Dick Giordano, funnily enough, when I was 18, I arranged to get a meeting with Dick Giordano, and I took my portfolio to show him. And the guy standing in the line in front of me was so much better than me. I was too embarrassed to show him my stuff, and I pitched him a story instead. And, so every writer I know really deep down wants to be an artist, don't they?
Probably. Yeah. I still love the art. And I did like, as the writer, it was fun for me because I could visualize the story. I knew when I was laying out the story in my brain that it could be drawn, right?
Yeah.
I wasn't asking for anything that was, 47 panels on a page or, anything that couldn't be done. But I never expected it, obviously, to look like the way I visualized it. And so it was fun for me when I would get the art back to see how the various artists had visualized the various stories. So I was art adjacent through all of this and just sort of getting the fun part of the art without doing any of the work.
Do you ever, when you're writing something, like you've worked with some of the greatest artists of all time, but do you try and write towards their strengths? Do you think about them at all? Or do you have your own style in your head when you're writing the story of how this is going to look? Do you try and kind of not think about the artist in that sense?
Yeah, no, I try to think about what are they good at? What do they like? I mean, again, the story's got to be the story. It can't, the specific instance there is when I did Doctor Strange, I did it with Frank Brunner and to start with. And Brunner had asked for me to be the writer because he had ideas of things he wanted to do. And he was working with Gardner Fox, and Gardner Fox was too old school to really roll with that.
Yeah.
So Frank asked if I would take it on. And I was actually full up by that time writing, but I wasn't going to turn down working with Frank on Doctor Strange. And so what we would do was, this was unusual. I mean, usually it was just I would write the story and we'd send it to the artist, and we'd do it kind of the way the structure is set up. But with Frank, we'd get together and have dinner, probably either at his house in the city or my house up in Connecticut. And then we'd sit down and he would say, well, here's what I want. I'm thinking I want to do this month. And I've said, well, I've got ideas. I want to do this. And we would just sort of bang it back and forth, sometimes till 3 a.m, until we had something, because it was always, in the end, it was my responsibility to make sure that we had a story, not just a series of pictures. And so, it had to come together for me, but it was certainly using my input and his input. Over the years, I've had various artists who will offer stuff, but most artists, I find, my experience has been most artists are just happy to draw. They're not really looking to tell stories. After Frank left, I got Gene Colan, Gene Colan, right? But Colan had no interest. I offered him, do you want to help me plot this? He's like, no, I'll just draw it.
Because I don't know what age Colin would be if he was alive now, but he must have been a good 20 years older than you were as well. That must have been a shock to him, coming out of romance comics and everything, to then get one of your scripts it'd be a cultural shift for him, wouldn't it?
Well, somewhere in between that, he had done, Daredevil and Submariner and so forth. Yeah. He'd done his superhero initiation. But yeah, the thing, this is getting a little maybe into the weeds for this thing, but with Brunner drew magic. The whole page just looked sparkly and weird. Colan drew photographically, right? Which was also, it was very cool to kind of see magic done photographically, you know. And so they each brought something different to it. I was trying to steer one character through all of that, right? So, but yeah, I mean, to go back to your original question, I mean, working with Colin, he just wanted to draw it, and I mean, he was famous around the office because he had once done some story of Captain America, I think, where Stan gave him a plot, and he used 19 of the 20 pages to get through half of it. And then the last page is just like all this stuff. So the word went out amongst the writers, if you're working with Gene, break it down page by page, you know, so that it flows. And I'm pretty sure I probably did that when I was doing it. But again, you know, it's like, it's Colin, right? So I mean, he's gonna take my suggestions, and there always were suggestions. I mean, because I was a writer, an artist first, and because, you know, you kind of have to do it when you're writing. I would describe stuff. Now, I mean, Alan Moore was famous for writing scripts that were the size of a phone book because he would describe every detail in every room. I didn't do that, but I mean, I tried to put in everything that I thought was relevant that the artist needed to know, which is really what you're supposed to do. But I might have seen a few more things that, you know, a non-visual person might not have seen or whatever. But in the end, I mean, I always said, these are suggestions. You know, it's not like this is what you have to draw. This is what we need to have there. But I mean, find your own way there.
I think what Colan did, it's interesting you bring it up because it was quite a big influence on me, which is if you're doing something outrageous like those stories, you know, it's more outrageous than a New York set Spider-Man story or whatever, to have an artist who grounds it in a sense of realism, it really blends it well, doesn't it? It kind of makes it accessible for a mainstream audience. Like Frank Brunner is amazing, but he brings the same head you're bringing to it really in a lot of ways, you know, where Colan... Somehow bringing the two of you together, it grounded something that might be hard for people to accept sometimes, you know? So that as a kid, that really worked for me, the Colan stuff, in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, the Brunner era is famous. I mean, it just, everybody loves the stuff that Frank did.
Yeah.
So I sometimes end up defending Gene Colan. It's like, you know, wait, there was another year here with this other guy. You may have heard of him. And I, you know, again, they were both fun for me. I mean, you know, it was like, I tried to play to each guy's strengths as we talked about. In the end, I go back, I'm making connections here the way a writer does. When I was handed complete creative freedom and Captain America and the Defenders, for that matter, I was also handed Sal Buscema. And I love Sal Buscema's stuff. And it's only in retrospect that I was able to say, yeah, it's great to have complete creative freedom. But if you're working with a guy who can't draw horses or can't draw hands or whatever, you have to tailor it to that. Whereas Sal could draw anything. It didn't matter. You know, Sal never got in touch with me and said, what do you mean by this? Or what? It's just like, no, I get it. I'll draw it. And I, you know, so I never had to like squelch my complete creative freedom. And so I owe a lot of whatever I became to having worked with artists like that, Sal in particular, but I mean, all the way through having people who, you know, brought something to the table and could let me be weird or whatever. I mean, to jump back to Batman, I mean, that whole Gotham City during our run, that was Marshall. Marshall just loved drawing the cityscapes, and so, which was exactly right, which was perfect, right? I didn't envision, you know, I mean, I envisioned the story, blah, 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 but the visuals of it, that was you know, I always thought that was, again, right place, right time. I mean, everybody, Terry Austin, everybody was like, wanted to do the best Batman they could, but the art for that was far more than I was expecting. Because at that time, all the superstars had left DC to go to Marvel. Neil had gone over, Gil Kane had gone over, Bob Brown had gone over. So the odds were, and I've said this a lot, you'll appreciate it. I mean, it's like the odds were that Batman was going to be drawn by, Joe Hack and Bill Journeyman, right? And if it had been, the scripts would have been exactly the same, but the books wouldn't have been as good, and therefore people wouldn't think the scripts were as good, right? They would just overall downgrade the whole package because people don't differentiate, I've found. They don't generally go, oh, well, the writing was good, but the art wasn't, or vice versa. They just read it as a comic book and it's all one thing. So, again, lucky to have been able to have access to all these guys, to draw these things.
The stars aligned, and I think, especially your period at Marvel at that time, it felt like you guys, it's almost like the parents had left the house and you guys were able to kind of do what you wanted. You could have a good time, Yeah. And what was the environment like? Were the books actually, I know there was a bit of a recession in comics in the 70s. Were the books selling at that point? Were there guys keeping an eye on the numbers? Were they giving you a hard time if things were dipping or anything? Or were your books doing so well it didn't really matter,
My books were doing well enough that I never had any pushback at all. Yeah. And again, that's editorial too. I mean, my famous touch point is when the president committed suicide in the White House at the end of the Captain America run. And people go, well, did they say it? No, they didn't, the book was selling and it was in on time and people were buying it. So that was all Marvel cared about. And they were happy with it. But yeah, I mean, I did whatever I did. Steve Gerber had his own, approach. Don McGregor had his own approach. We all, benefited from the ability to just, I mean, it was a Marvel comic. It had to kind of fit somewhere in the Marvel gestalt, but the voices became multiple at that point. Yeah. As far as I know, books were doing great in the 70s. I mean, DC had problems, I think, because Marvel had passed them by. I'd been working on that low level thing at Marvel for probably no more than a month when Marvel finally surpassed DC in sales. And Martin Goodman, the publisher, took us all out to dinner at DC's favorite restaurant.
Wow.
To celebrate. So Marvel was doing great. And there was that time when everybody was going to raise their books to 25 cents and add material. And then I was not privy to that, but I know that internally Marvel, after they did it for 1 month, said, no, we don't want to do that, and backed out of it, which caught DC off guard and, et cetera. But so I don't know if that was if the numbers took a real plunge at that point or something. But whatever, Marvel backed out of it after a month, and we just went on doing what we were doing. And I never encountered any indication that there was a financial problem with Marvel.
Because you guys are it's a half a generation on from Stan Lee, Roy was somewhere in the middle, wasn't he? But the rest of you guys were young guys. Like, did Stan get it? Did Stan understand those books?
He did.
What was being done, or was he just West Coast at that point and kind of leaving it to Roy and Jerry and Marv and those guys?
Well, I think both. I think, I mean, I worked for him in my voluminous career. In the year 2000, he was doing Stan Lee Media, which was going to do interactive stories on the internet, and it eventually failed because the internet wasn't fast enough at that point to be able to do animation, really. Yeah. But I went to work for him then, and Stan was always a kid in his head. I mean, he was a showman and he got old and he did all those things, but he was, he loved the ambiance of comics. And so after he went to the West Coast, I mean, I think that was his primary. He was trying to convince somebody that they should do superhero movies, whatever, which always seemed like a quixotic, ridiculous concept to me at the time. I mean, because the only movies we had seen at that point was there was a couple of Captain America movies and there was a Doctor Strange movies, and they were all, low grade TV of the week kind of movies, if that. So the idea that there would ever be anything like there is now never occurred to any of us. And so I credit Stan for, going out there and taking a shot at it. It took him, 30 years, but he eventually got there. But I also think, I mean, again, Stan at the end was physically old, but he was not mentally old. Roy is 7 years older than me, and I don't really see him slowing down anytime soon. I'm not. I think something about comics kind of keeps you young if you appreciate, if you appreciate the deal. And also, if you're going to do comics, you have to be kind of plugged into the world around you and so forth. Yeah. So you don't end up sitting in a garret somewhere all by yourself, cut off from everything. I think you're living life on one level or another. So hopefully, I say for myself, I hope, goes on for a while.
There's a disproportionate number of comic guys make it into their 90s, and weirdly, a lot of them are still working in their 80s and 90s as well, which I think you're onto something with this, because you have to have enthusiasm for comics in a way that almost unlike any other job.
Yeah. And
yet people used to age out, didn't they? They used to talk about, DC had a thing where they didn't want anyone over 30, I remember hearing at one time, because they felt they should be kind of close in age to the readership. Were you ever aware of that? That there was a sort of checkout time with comics?
No. I mean, I think ageism is in there somewhere, but the difference is, it goes back to what I've seen of Marvel and DC. Marvel was always a bunch of people who really liked comics doing comics. And DC was a publishing house that hired people to prepare content. Right. That was the two different approaches from corporate level. Yeah. And so I'm sure DC had various rules where they said, oh, well, these kids today, got to fire people if they're over 30. But Marvel never, Marvel was just like, can you do the book? Is it selling? Is it coming in on time? Then, then there you are. I do think that, when Marvel did go bankrupt, when they finally, blew it all up in the 90s, and they went through 5 years, whatever it was, of bankruptcy, the people who came out the other side of that in the late 90s, early 2000s, I always felt had their own feeling that there had been a gap, that there was a cutoff, and that everybody from before that time was in a different situation. Yeah. When I did do stuff in the 2000s, there was already more corporate control, right? You had to run it past only a couple levels of editors, but the editor and the editor-in-chief had to sign off on this stuff. And I can say I didn't appreciate that. I was used to having complete freedom to do what I did. And so they were at one point, they were going to take all the Malibu characters and bring them into Marvel. And they asked me to do that. And one of the requirements was, tell us what you're going to do in the first 12 issues. And it's like, I have no idea what I'm going to do in the first one. I know what I'm going to do in the first issue, and then I'll write the second issue, and I'll find out what I'm going to do then. That's how I do stuff, right? I mean, it's just like, my stories are more organic. It's like, if the guy did this, then that's where we're going to start from next time, rather than, try to fit him into some long-term plan. So there was a difference in Marvel at the turn of the century. They were more cost conscious because they'd just been bankrupt, and the editors who had gone through it had sort of amassed the power to themselves. When I did come back, Brevoort asked me to do a Patsy Walker Hellcat story, and I said, well, because it used to be the writers were completely in charge of their books. I knew everything about Captain America. I wrote the letters pages, the answers to the letters page, and so did Gerber, and so did McGregor, and all that. So I said to Brevoort, I don't really know what has happened to her since I last saw her. And he said, you don't have to know. The editor knows that stuff now. Well, I'll just tell you. As it turns out, he didn't give me all the information that I might have needed, and people caught me in a couple of, things that I got wrong. But it's like, because he didn't tell me that, and I didn't know. And I will say, I love Patsy. Well, I love them all. I mean, whatever. But I love Patsy Walker. She was cool, and she'd become the Hellcat under my tutelage, and so on and so forth. So I said, well, what has happened to her since I was last here? And he said, well, she married the son of Satan and then committed suicide and went to hell. Okay, well, I will pick it up from there, I guess, So I was not as comfortable doing comics in the 2000s. And so then I went off and wrote books, prose books, and so on and so forth. I mean, it's just like, once again.
I'd never thought about this until you brought this up, but do you think the weight of a universe kind of collapses after time? That it collapses stories? Because, when you're doing these things, you're doing them 10 years, 5 years after Stan and Jack and so on. So you can't, everybody, and there's only one book per character, But when you've got 100 X-Men books every month and everything, imagine the Lord of the Rings going on for 500 volumes. Like, it would be baffling to, Is it maybe an intrinsic flaw with the logic of universes?
It could be. I don't know if I'd go that far, but I mean, I loved the continuity. I loved the fact that it was a universe and that Daredevil did meet the Fantastic Four, and you could refer to that if you needed to, whatever. And I was 10 years from the beginning of Marvel Comics, and 3 from Stan and Jack or whatever, or not even that. I think Kirby had quit like just 6 months or something before I came in. So I loved working with continuity. I loved the fact that you built this world, and I did everything I could to like make this world coherent. In the 90s, when I was working for Malibu, we did a whole bunch of crossover stuff. And for the first time, people were going, well, now, wait a minute. You mean I have to go buy this other book in order to understand this book? And I thought, well, no, of course, that's the fun part about it. But people buy, the books were whatever they were, $2.99. I don't know what they were at that point. But also, 40 years out, 60 years out, you can't very well say, well, yeah, go look at Fantastic Four number 37. We used to. So, I mean, I get the fact that you can't keep the continuity. On the other hand, I was up at the Marvel offices sometimes, even though I live in California. I would, go back there 4 times a year for a week at a time. And I can remember walking past an editorial meeting where they're going, what if we made the Hulk red? And it was like they were thinking sales burst things rather than the characters, rather than the continuity end of things. And again, by that time, maybe that was the way to go, but it didn't, I'm a product of my era in that sense, in that that doesn't interest me. When in the 80s, when they were going to start a second Spider-Man book, they asked me to write it. And I said, I don't want to write a second Spider-Man book. You know, I want to write Spider-Man if I'm going to write Spider-Man. But I mean, so no, that approach never did much.
It's funny to
for
see.
Me, but again, it may well be what needs to be done now, you know.
It's interesting though, because Amazing Spider-Man always quite massively outsold Spectacular Spider-Man. So the audience felt the same way, didn't they? Yeah.
I think so. Well, Amazing was the real one, right? I mean, that's the one everybody had been with. And obviously there was enough of an audience for a second Spider-Man book that the book stayed in print, kept going. In fact, there were probably several more Spider-Man books, but that approach didn't interest me. I didn't want to write that stuff.
Because when you went over to DC, actually, I always thought of DC as quite distinct storylines. They were almost like fairy tales as opposed to being part of a cohesive continuity. You could read DC books in any order for the most part, you know. Yeah. Whereas Marvel, it was an ongoing soap opera, wasn't it? But I think that's what's made your Batman run so timeless, though, as well, because I read it several years after it came out. You know, a guy in a comic shop said to me, I can't believe you haven't read this, you know, and like...
And they're doing it, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, when I went over there, I mean, the reason I quit Marvel for editorial snafu reasons, whatever. And my wife had traveled in Europe for a year before I knew her, and I thought that sounded cool. And so we started gearing up to go to Europe, as you mentioned. And then Jeanette Kahn called, new publisher at DC, and she said, I want you to do for the Justice League what you did for the Avengers. Give them personalities, give them storylines, etc.
Yeah.
And I said, well, I'm probably leaving here in 9 months, so I can only give you, a certain number. And she, that's fine. And I said, and I would like to write Batman per se, because I thought that was my one shot to write the character that I really loved. And, so that's how I got that stuff. But I mean, Jeanette had been brought in from a children's book. She was running a children's book for Warner's. And she got it. She was younger. I mean, she and I think we're the same age. And so she got the idea, Marvel's doing it right. Let's do that. She tried to hire me, and she tried to hire John Buscema. And she didn't get John Buscema, but she got me. And so I had a good time on the Justice League. Nobody remembers the Justice League either because Batman overshadows it. But it was fun doing the Justice League. But it was fun doing the Batman. And then at the end of 8-9 months, I brought it to a close and I left, So in my brain, that Batman run was always one story. I mean, it was just, little too early to be thinking about, this will be collected. This will be easy to collect or whatever. But I mean, so it definitely had a beginning, middle, and end because that's all the time I could give it. But but it worked well for that character.
Would I be right in thinking it was the first time a DC comic had been structured like that? In the terms of an organic arc with little subplots that ran through it and pulled it together with threads. I don't remember anything like that prior to. I mean, I could be wrong, but there was nothing.
No, I think you're right. No, that's what she wanted me for. To do that kind of thing. Because again, she was taking over the company when all of the superstars had left it, right?
Yeah.
So she had to hire some or one or whatever, and B, her job was on the line if something didn't work. So,
what do you think caused that migration? Because it's such an interesting time at DC. I talked to Jeanette a few months ago, and it's kind of daunting what she did. She's a 26-year-old, 27-year-old coming in with no real comic book experience. And she reinvented the wheel, really. What she did by the early 80s was phenomenal. It was incredible, And you were one of her first hires. She talked about that. But what do you think caused the migration away from DC at that point? Was it just Marvel was a cool place to be? Or
yeah, I think so. I think, it's one thing. I mean, Neil Neil was not suffering by doing Batman or any of that stuff. But I think, people were just having more fun at Marvel. People were just, it was just a more freewheeling thing. Neil, I can't speak for Neil on this. This is all speculation on my part. But he was comfortable working as an artist for hire for a corporation that was turning out product, because he was turning out great product and he was happy, whatever. But I think everybody just sort of, Gil Kane done Green Lantern forever. And then he decided he wanted to do Spider-Man, Neil wanted to do X-Men. I think there was just so much more freedom, for one thing, and possibility for another, that everybody did just sort of go. And there were very few people that you would now look back and go, yeah, those guys were giants of their industry, still at DC at that point. Arnold Drake, who had written the Doom Patrol and had done stuff for years, went over. Bob Brown. I was able to work with Bob Brown, which was great.
Yeah.
It's just DC was really moribund. There was a time, it would have been 73, somewhere in there. I was still on staff at Marvel. The word was that DC was going to go out of business, and Marvel was like, we can buy them. Let's buy them. And people were already thinking, Gene Colan on Batman, John Buscema on Superman. This would be great.
Yeah.
That didn't happen. But I know DC was pretty at a pretty low ebb at that point.
Yes.
Whereas, as I said before, I never saw any of that with Marvel. Marvel seemed to be doing just fine.
Because you felt like the turning point in a lot of ways for Batman in particular, which had been kind of, post the TV show, other than Denny and Neil Adams, it had been pretty lackluster for a good decade, And you felt like the turning point with Batman becoming cool again. Like you were the Neil Armstrong of that sort of cool Batman before you had 30 years of great Batman,
Well, I loved the character. And one of the things I loved when they'd done giant size reprints, every once in a while, they'd bring out a story from the early days. Yeah. And I really loved that whole pulp atmosphere. You must use gallons of black ink inking early Batmans, and I wanted to get that back. I thought, well, it's been pretty bland, but let's get some real pulp atmosphere and bring back the cool stuff from that era, which was the Joker as a homicidal maniac. Yeah. And also Hugo Strange, whatever. And at the same time, I was juggling two other concepts. One, well, maybe they're the same concept, but as a kid, I had thought it was weird that whenever Lois Lane would snuggle up to Superman, he'd kind of blush and back away. And I thought, that's not what adults do. I was aware enough to know that adults don't work like that. So I really wanted to bring Batman, I wanted to make him an adult person. Yeah. Bruce Wayne, right? And that's where Silver St. Cloud came from. He could have a sexual relationship under the code with a strong woman, a woman who would have to be strong to hang out with Bruce Wayne. And so I got back the atmosphere that had been lost, but then I also developed him to be a more flesh and blood character. I'm always more interested in the guy rather than the costume. I love the costume. I love the powers and all that stuff, but I'm interested in who's doing that, who's in there. And so, in my short 8-issue run, we got much darker, but we also got sex and adulthood. And then when that was done, Michael Uslan said, now I see how to do Batman as an adult, and set off to do that. And, we were off to the races.
So I remember it was always a rumour around comic stores, through the 80s when I was a kid, and you'd listen to the adult chat, at the till. They would always say they were adapting your story. That's what I always heard. You would see it in fanzines. It would be chat among creators. And so the Silver St. Cloud, Hugo Strange, Joker story, we were just waiting for it to be the 1989 Batman movie. And it owed a lot to it. But I've heard rumours over the years of your involvement in various levels and everything. What's the true story of all of that? What was really going on behind the scenes?
Well, that's, this is why I'm not a huge DC fan. Let me just qualify that by saying that Jim Lee and I now have a good relationship. And so DC, for all I know, is a much better place to be than it used to be. But in that particular instance, Michael Uslan set out to adapt my story, to the movies.
Yeah.
And I was not involved in that. Again, I was a comic book writer in an era when comics was its own thing.
Yeah.
But 10 years later, Jeanette called me up and she said they've had half a dozen scripts by various Hollywood people, including Tim Burton, and nobody can get the atmosphere right. So we would like you to, work on these scripts to get them where they need to be. And everything I did was done through Jeanette. I never met Sam Hamm. I never met Tim Burton.
Right.
She would send me the script. I would go through it. And in those days, if you remember the Chris Reeve Superman movies, people who did comic book movies always had to kind of show you that they didn't take it seriously because they were real filmmakers.
Yeah.
And so there was always some funny stuff in it somewhere. My story did not have funny stuff in it. And so they would send me the scripts and I would tone down the Robert Wool reporter character.
Yeah.
And I would tone up the darkness and the relationship between Bruce and Silver. It was always Bruce and Silver in every script I saw.
That's
right?
the rumor I heard. Yeah, I heard Vicky Vale.
Yeah. It was, the thing I was working on was Bruce and Silver, Boss Thorne, the Joker, whatever. And so I doctored several of those scripts. And then they said, thanks, we're good now. And then, it's fine. I was hired as a hired gun to do that sort of thing. I learned later that was all totally illegal under Writers Guild rules, that I didn't get paid what I should have been paid. I didn't get the credit I should have gotten, But however that happened, and I can't say how that happened, but somehow or other, the movie to Jeanette, to me, was the circuit, so that I never interacted with the movie people directly. Right. But the last script I saw, still Bruce and Silver. And then the movie came out. I went to see it on my own dime and discovered that now it was Vicky Vale.
Right.
And so I, got in touch with Jeanette and I said, what was that about? And she said, we changed the names because now we don't have to pay you any royalties.
Oh my God. Wow.
And I thought, okay, well, welcome to Hollywood, right? And welcome to the inner workings of DC. And then for the next 30 years, me and Marshall were not asked, well, another 20 years from there. But, we went 30 years between the first Batmans we did and the next Batmans we did, because DC doesn't want it to be known as the Englehart Rogers Batman or the Alan Moore Watchman or, or the Jimmy Palmiotti and I forget her name, but they don't get to be the Harley Quinn people. DC wants it all to be DC stuff, or it did. Maybe it's changed. But no, DC basically ripped me off, and I understood that after a while, and so I didn't appreciate it.
That's incredible.
So that's the answer to your question.
I'm amazed at that. What year did you start to have conversations about the Batman movie then? What year would that be?
Which conversations?
The very first conversations about you talking to them about the Batman 1989 movie. What year would that be?
86. That was 86.
So quite a long process then. You were involved for a while.
Yeah, no, I've got copies of all the scripts that the other people wrote, and they're all, good, solid Hollywood stories.
Yeah.
But not the atmosphere, right? Not the sense of darkness and all that, So
that also explains. You remember Archie Goodwin had a book called Legends of the Dark Knight, and
right.
I remember my friends and I used to always say, "Why isn't there an Englehart and Rogers run on this? I mean, this seems the most obvious." So it's because there was a bit of a bad blood, yeah.
Yeah, they didn't. I mean, looking back at it, I'm happy to have written the Justice League and Batman and whatever else, but I was not happy working for people. And again, Jeanette was involved, and it was 10 years in, so she could have been completely corrupted by that time. I don't know, but I don't really know her feelings about this, whether she knew that this was illegal. They could have just said to her, contact this guy and you deal with him and so forth. I don't know. But
so when you came back after the time, when you came back from working in games and you're back doing Green Lantern, did DC have a different vibe to how it felt in the 70s?
Well, Giordano was in charge at that point, and he was my friend. So that was, useful. It's hard to say if there was a different vibe. I mean, because I was working with totally different people, and so whatever vibe we had was that vibe. I do know I did Millennium, the DC crossover thing, in 86, I think. And when it was done, I had a new group of superheroes. I had taken normal people, random people from around the world and given them powers. And they wanted to, obviously, to turn that into a series. And I wanted to call it Trumps, as in the high cards in a deck. Yeah. And Jeanette said to me in 1986, Jeanette said, no, we can't do that because Donald would be upset. He was already a force in New York society, Yeah. So it became the New Guardians. And I went to Dick, went up to his house in Connecticut, and I said, if I'm going to do this series, I want to do like sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I want to do like, the real world. I want to get into that. And he said, yes, you can absolutely do that. And then when I wrote my first issue, the editor, whom you can look up, but I don't have to name, said, well, no, you can't do this and you can't do that. And so I went to Dick and I said, but you told me I could, and you're the editor-in-chief. And he said, well, I have to defer to my editors. And I thought that was a little, he'd been a little corrupted by that time. So I bailed on the New Guardians at that point. And a quick funny story on that is I plotted the second issue. Carrie Bates wrote it, but I had plotted it, and I had this character called Snowflame, who was a South American cocaine lord. But I plotted it. I didn't write it and forgot about it. And years later, I got this email from somebody saying, Snowflame is my favorite character. I'm like, who the fuck is Snowflame? I just don't know who that is. Why are you telling me this? I had to look it up. But anyway, yeah. So in 2005, I guess, Dan DiDio was now in charge. And he came and he said, we're putting out these Christopher Nolan movies and we need more Batman products. So we want you and Marshall to come back and do it. And that's, so that's how the 30-year hiatus ended. But,
right.
DC's just way too corporate. Well, DC was way too corporate.
I think
Maybe it is.
I think at every stage, like when I was growing up, it was actually that really nice Dick Giordano time. So I didn't think of it as that corporate, But when you step back from it and look at it overall, since the 30s, DC's always been the collar and tie place, isn't it? And Marvel feels a bit more like a frat house.
Right. Yep. That's absolutely right. Yeah. And that's absolutely right. It's not Marvel hype about the bullpen or any of that stuff. It was a bullpen. It was it was a small group of people all doing comics. Yeah. And DC, they had, people did wear suits and ties to go to work,
But that run you did when you did come back at DC, the Green Lantern run, I absolutely loved it. I thought it was so good. I love Guy Green Lantern. Goes back as a big character and everything. You're so instrumental in lots of things. Whether it's Star-Lord, Guy Gardner, re-envisioning Batman, bringing Marvel style to the Justice League or whatever. That's what I've always, as a writer, I've always admired about you. Everything feels important.
Yeah, well, I took it as important. I wanted to do good comics. I like good comics. And insofar as I could produce something that other people would think were good comics, that's what I wanted to do. Yeah. I don't know your writing style, but how you go about it. But when I was doing a book a week, I would take one day and I would think up the plot. And then the second day, I would just play with the plot. How could I make the plot better?
Yeah.
What could I do? What connection could I make? Then I'd take 3 days to write it. And then I'd take one day to let it sit there and go, okay, now what can I do now? Is there anything else I can do to this thing before I send it off? So I was always looking to I called it paper mache. I always was like, how can I build the best thing I can build here? And that's just me. I wanted a comic that I would think was a good comic, I remember after I got the Avengers one day going, I'm the only Avengers fan in the world who doesn't get to go down to the newsstand and have a good time every month because I got to come up with the stories, I took it seriously. It's like, yeah. But again, serious is one thing. The idea that they would be adapting those stories into movies later, that was never, there was never any sense of we were doing it in the moment. This is for March 1974. That's what this is. Next month I'll do April, and the idea that it would still be in print, that all that stuff would be still reprinted continuously, that they would make movies out of it. It comes back to the fact on one level that I tried to do the best thing I could at the time, but I never thought that anything else would come of it other than you would be entertained this month, And
it's funny, something that was relatively niche for a certain age group, usually male skewed, back in the 70s, must be strange for you to watch grandmothers and children, all knowing who Star-Lord is or seeing the toys in shops and things like that, Could you ever have imagined this world that we're living in for the last 25 years? It's incredible.
No, not at all. Not at all. There was comics and there were a couple of attempts to do movies that were bad. And there were a couple of animation shows that were bad.
Yeah.
And that was it. And again, in those days, comics was a bubble. People who liked comics. Marvel sold 750,000 to 1 million copies every month of its best-selling books, maybe more on the best-selling books. So everybody who liked comics read comics, and everybody who didn't read comics knew that they were trash. You couldn't go up to somebody. Happened to me if somebody handed me a book, but you couldn't. I tried over those early years. I'd say, well, read this. This is Jack Kirby, and it's and it's really good, and you'll like it. And it's like, no, it's just for teenage dropouts and sailors. That's the only people who read comic books, right? And so that's the other thing I could not have imagined, that now everybody knows who Star-Lord is, right? I mean, it's become part of the culture. But it was definitely, you were working the other side of the tracks on some level if you were doing comics in those days.
See, I was lucky that a lot of the heavy lifting had been done by previous generations, and that if I said I was a comic book writer specifically working at Marvel back when I was a Marvel guy, people thought it was kind of cool. But you must have been doing it at a time, especially in New York, where it's a kind of cool scene and everything. Was it slightly embarrassing at that point to be a comic book writer?
Yeah, well, in my real life, when I would go to parties and people would say, "Well, what do you do?" I'd say, "Well, I write short stories."
Right.
That's what I said. I wasn't going to admit to writing comic books.
Yeah.
And yet, if you were over in the comic book bubble, lots of enthusiasm, lots of fun, all that good stuff, right? But it did not translate outside the bubble in those days.
And just to sort of wrap up, like what has blown you away in that cinematic side of things? Do you still feel that excitement that you felt in the 60s and the 70s whenever there's a Sam Raimi Spider-Man or an Avengers movie or whatever? Can you still connect with that version of yourself, that sees a sense of wonder when you see it on the big screen?
Yes and no. I mean, I can connect to that version of myself, but I don't always see the sense of wonder on the screen.
Yeah.
Couple of things. One, the beats in a 2-hour movie are different from the beats in a 19-page story, right? And the one thing I noticed early on, fight scenes in comics are a chance for everybody to think. But in fight scenes in movies are just fight scenes, right? That nobody's doing much exposition while they're doing that. So there are things you can't do, or at least haven't been done. In the movies. So I'm less, but I mean, like Avengers Endgame was a great comic book thing.
Yeah.
By and large, I'm less, I enjoy the movies. I'm happy to see them. I like to see the characters, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't get the same thrill necessarily. I mean, Benedict Cumberbatch as Doctor Strange gives me a thrill. He's very good at that, But the other thing, when I did a comic called Nightman for Malibu, and they made a TV series out of it. They made it for like $1.25 an episode. I mean, it was designed to be cheaply done, but they did my character right. And so that made me happy. And I wanted to write for it. There was nothing in our contracts that said I got to write for any spinoff, any TV show. So I had to go audition for my own character, but I passed the audition. And then, I learned, I always said writing, because I did so many different kinds of writing. I always said it's like an American analogy, baseball. But I always said it's always like, you know how to play baseball. You go from park to park. The fences are different lengths. There's this and that and the other thing. So you adjust to whatever park you're in, but you're still playing baseball. I learned the great lesson of Hollywood when I was doing that. I wrote a script in which Nightman and his friend went outside, and there was a group of people waiting to attack them. And the showrunner took me aside and he said, "Look, in television, you have to pay for everything. We're not going to pay for a group of people. There's going to be 2 people waiting for him outside." So it's like, so these are real people who have to get paid, and therefore Chris Evans signs up for 3 issues and then he's gone. So then, or 3 issues, 3 movies. You can't just do Captain America with Chris Evans forever. Because you got to take Chris Evans into account for all of this. And I think that's also had a sort of a detrimental effect on the movies. I like I'm blanking his name, but the new Captain America. I like him.
Anthony Mackie.
Yeah. I like him. He was perfectly fine in that movie. And I think they did a decent job of the transition and so on and so forth. But you're kind of having to reinvent things every 3 movies, as opposed to just having a universe or whatever that you can run with. I mean, there are other problems Marvel has run into with the Disney Plus stuff. I mean, that's another topic. But to answer your question, I mean, I'm enjoying Daredevil right now on Disney Plus. If it's good, I like it. But I think they have the problems I mentioned in trying to, do an ongoing thing. And then real quickly on Disney Plus, I don't know what it's called in England, but they sort of threw away the idea of a coherent universe at that point. They kind of said, you want to do the She-Hulk, go do your own She-Hulk. You want to do Ghost Rider, who do I mean? Moon Knight, go do your own Moon Knight.
Yeah.
And so the stories didn't really add up to much, and they didn't go anywhere, and they didn't do, so they kind of frittered away a lot of the good vibes that Marvel had by trying to program for Disney Plus. All that's all stuff that doesn't apply to comic books, right? I mean, so comic books, if you got a writer and an artist, you can do Captain America forever and it won't change, or
That's true, because John Buscema, Sal Buscema, whoever, you just accept it's the same character, don't you? Even if there's a different guy drawing the book, it's still the same character, but the actor, it completely changes the feeling, doesn't it? That's why they have to have a big gap between James Bonds, isn't it?
Yeah. I don't know what they're going to do. I mean, I know they're rebooting James Bond, whatever that means, but I don't know how they're going to do that.
2 of my friends are up for the part. They're down to a few guys, and 2 of my pals are up for the part of Bond, which would kind of ruin James Bond for me, actually, because I don't want it to be a guy I'd go for a drink with. I want it to be James Bond when I go and see that movie.
Yeah.
But listen, before I go, I just want to say to you, what I always associate your name with, apart from quality, is expensive back issues. See, when I see your name, it'll always, because a comic store always justifies the ridiculous price on the back issue, and they'll always write, Alex Toth or something like that, and Englehart, you would always get in small letters above the ridiculous price, and I'd always be like, oh man, I have to wait till Christmas before I can get that 2-part Englehart story, but it's worth it in the end, Steve, because you've had an amazing career, Well,
it's been fun. I mean, I do love comics. I've said this 7 times already. I mean, again, just to wrap it up, when I went off and wrote prose novels, I discovered I'm not really interested in writing scene description. I don't want to write, they stood by the window while the rain, it's like, no, I want to write the characters. I want them to go someplace. I want to write dialogue and snappy action sequences. And that's, I am a comic book writer at the end of the day, with all the other stuff that I've done. And and I've had fun doing them, and I've done other stuff, but something about comics really just speaks to me personally,
No, I get it.
So sorry that I did it so well that you went broke, but
I have no money left, But listen, thanks for the comics. Thanks for taking the time today. Brilliant speaking to you.
Sure. Yeah.
All the best,
All right.
then. Thank you.
You too, Mark.
See you later.